Well, hello again. Welcome back to my presentations here. I wanted to really share with you an essay that I found in the Wall Street Journal. You can actually purchase a copy of this by going to that particular website. But I wanted to highlight this essay. It was written by John Tierney and Roy F. Baumeister, and this was published in December 27, 2019. But this really has to do with the negativity bias, that we now have shown that this is what the brain does. And our brain's negativity bias has evolved because it's a survival mechanism. But what worked for our ancestral hunter-gatherers doesn't always work for us. And that's a quote from their article. So apparently this is a universal tendency for bad events and emotions to affect us much more strongly than positive ones, oddly enough. We're devastated by a word of criticism, but unmoved by a shower of praise. So basically, we might be seeing hostile faces in the crowd, but miss all of the friendly smiles. So we focus so much on bad news, especially in this digital world, that it magnifies the power of that, so that we don't realize how much better life is becoming for people around the world, oddly enough. So we can break these destructive patterns, we can make smarter decisions, see the world more realistically, and also exploit the benefits of this bias. But bad is really stronger than good. But good can prevail if we know what to do and how to take care of that. So this negativity effect was an aspect of psychology that wasn't really discovered until about 20 years ago, and quite unexpectedly. So social scientists became intrigued with the patterns of studying people's reactions and found that bad first impressions had a much greater impact than good first impressions. So the experiments went on by behavioral economists showing that a financial loss loomed much larger than a corresponding financial gain. So what gave bad its greater power? So Dr. Baumeister and his colleagues at Case Western University looked at the situation in which bad events didn't have a strong impact. Okay, so they proposed to identify several contrary patterns that would enable them to develop this elaborate, complex, and nuanced theory about when bad is stronger versus when good is stronger. And to their surprise, they did not find that. They couldn't find any compelling counter-examples of good being stronger. So that the bad health or bad parenting makes much more difference than good health or good parenting. So for example, a negative image or a photograph of a dead animal stimulates more electrical activity in the brain than does a positive image, like a bowl of chocolate ice cream. For example, too, the pain of criticism is much stronger than the pleasure of praise. So a single bad event can produce lifelong trauma, but there are no psychological terms for the opposite of trauma because no good event has such lasting impact. That's an amazing piece of understanding about how the brain works. So psychologists went on and discovered this major phenomenon that extended into so many different fields that had previously escaped notice. So Dr. Baumeister's paper that he co-authored with several other researchers was published in the Review of General Psychology, entitled simply, "Bad is Stronger Than Good." So both are now among the most cited papers in the social science literature. And also science, I think our psychology of science has really also developed into the psychology, positive psychology. The power of positive thinking, it's not just a simple statement. It's a little bit harder to achieve that, but that doesn't alter the fact that we really do have to work at that. It's not something that comes naturally to us because our brain is so negatively biased. So this survival mechanism is something that we can really do something about. But you know, these were passed on, this idea of negative bias is passed on by our genes. We're the ones who paid more attention to threats than to the good life, to the good things in life. And this bias is still useful. One mistake can be fatal, but what worked for hunter-gatherers don't always work for us. So today we're really assailed around the clock by merchants of bad. Politicians and journalists, they tap into our primal emotions and they hype threats from nature, technology, foreigners, political opponents as well. Also science, whatever will instantly trigger the brain's alarm circuits. So rarely a week goes by without some new warning that civilization is doomed. One psychologist really, when they finally identified this negative effect, realized that it's been distorting their own profession for centuries. And basically, this is one of the reasons why I want to present all of this information, because we can do something about that negative bias and learn from our experiencing. We're not going to be better people. We can have better behaviors, and cognitive behaviors are critical. For example, even in the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, there is some common knowledge, but not the concept of post-traumatic growth. Oddly enough, that concept seems to go by the wayside. Most people who undergo trauma ultimately feel that the experience has made them a stronger person. Now, the interesting part of this essay goes on to look at that psychologists began compensating this by studying the positivity ratio, so which is the number of good events or emotions for every bad one. And this is really kind of a phenomenal, I think, piece that is really not identified much in things that we read. So researchers really found that older people were typically more contented than younger ones because they learned how to improve this ratio in their lives. They've gone on what they call a low-bad diet. And that general approach can work for people of all ages. So here are a few strategies that they identify in this essay. First, do no harm. Avoiding bad is far more important than doing good. You get relatively much credit for doing more than you promised, but you pay a big price for falling short. So when they were researching couples over time, the psychologists found that the success of marriages depended mainly on the frequency of negative interactions and how people deal with negativity. So in marriages that are destined for success, people overlook their spouse's flaws. And researchers call this positive illusions. or sometimes I guess we might say faking it until we make it, or whatever that is. Or I really would see that from an RABT perspective as accepting that we are fallible human beings, and basically that we can make errors and judgments and we can learn from our experience. So when something goes wrong, they either give their spouse the benefit of the doubt or respond calmly so as not to escalate the conflict. That's really what we've been talking about all along, how to stop escalating the disturbances that we do by the way we talk to ourselves. So in marriages that fail, people assume the worst and respond angrily. And because bad emotions are so powerful and contagious, any minor argument can quickly spiral out of control and into a major war, or sometimes, as we call it, kitchen sink battles. So they also go on to say that basically remember the rule of 4. So many studies of interactions, diaries, workers' mood, customers' ratings have shown that a negative event or emotion usually has at least 3 times the impact of a comparable positive one. What an important piece of research. So to come out ahead, they're suggesting that we keep in mind the rule of 4. It takes 4 good things to overcome 1 bad thing. So that's a very interesting ratio. And this is just a rule of thumb. It's not a universal law of nature. It doesn't apply to everybody in every situation, but it's a useful gauge of well-being and progress. For example, if you have 4 good days at work from Monday to Thursday, that's usually enough to make up for a bad Friday. Although, I don't know, I find that sometimes when bad news comes along on Fridays, then that's really kind of hard for people to really work at getting out of their mind over the weekend until they can finally begin to resolve, what their concern is about that. But keep that ratio in mind when considering the impact of your actions. Plan on at least 4 compliments to make up for 1 bit of criticism. Also, put the bad moments to good use. Instead of despairing in a setback, override your gut reaction and look for a useful lesson. I often say that to people. Look for what you liked about how the transaction went. Look for what you didn't like about how your transaction went. And this is not a blame game. This is really good feedback on your interactions and learning from your experience. Learning how to discern the differences is really important. They go on to say, capitalize on the good moments and then relive them. Now, I call that positive practice. Okay? And one of the reasons why I don't I really encourage my clients not to repeat over and over bad things that happen to them, because they're just practicing keeping those bad moments in their life alive. I would rather help them learn how to acknowledge that that happened, and so that they can begin to reword how they talk to themselves about it, so that they can have a reduced over-arousal about the bad moments that have happened in their lives. They go on to say, looking at the big picture, so that just about every measure of human welfare is improving except one, and they call that hope. The better life gets, the gloomier our worldview. In international surveys, they go on to say it's the rich who sound the most pessimistic and the worst informed. The global state of poverty has declined by 2/3 in recent decades, but most people in affluent countries think it has remained steady or gotten worse. For example, crime really has plummeted in the US, but most Americans think it is rising because they see so much mayhem on their screens. So we are being fed that by our media, and as long as you're able to manage that, then that's not something that has to be really unpleasant for you. But if you don't want to, then basically I often suggest to people, watch situation comedies. Find things that are funny for you to watch, things that are inspiring, those kinds of things. But really stop wallowing and repeating over and over to yourself the bad news that you hear. So by rationally looking at long-term trends instead of viscerally reacting to the horror story of the day, and they go on to say, you will see that there's much more to celebrate than to mourn. No matter what disasters occur in 2020, no matter who wins the presidential election, the average person in America and the rest of the world will in all likelihood become healthier and wealthier. So those who also go on a low-bad diet, they say, will also become wisier, also become wiser and happier too. If you want to learn more about rational emotive behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, I would refer you to the website for the Albert Ellis Institute, and it's albertellis.org, O-R-G, because they have a lot of books there that are available to you. There are videos that you can access, and I would suggest that you keep your learning experience going. If you're new to this channel, please go back to the first session, which can explain more about how your mind and brain work together. I think that will be more satisfactory in terms of your basic understanding of all the things that we've been saying up to now. My happiness really depends upon learning how to develop rational alternative statements so that you can get better, stay better, feel better. Because that's really the name of really what we need to do to help ourselves. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate your watching this, and I'm going to probably go on to doing more of these presentations, and I hope you will subscribe to my future presentations, because I'm going to be talking about how I combine rational emotive behavior therapy with the neurofeedback or the neuroscience that I use to help people. So the negative bias doesn't have to mess up your life. You can do something about that. It can be managed, and there are lots of little devices to use to help you along the way.